Last week, Dr. Craig talked about my view, which I call the prophetic days view. He referred to it as the days of divine fiat view. And I'll tell you the reason I call it the prophetic days view is I always thought it was a little bit easier to understand that I believe that what God spoke on each of the days is like a prophecy. And when God speaks a prophecy, it doesn't come to pass the very day that he speaks it. It takes time for it to be fulfilled. So it's not unusual for God to speak something and then have it happen later. But it is usually referred to as the days of divine fiat view. Give you a little bit of my background. I became a Christian in 1985 while attending Georgia Tech. I am a native Atlantan. I came from the south side of town, Riverdale, College Park area. It didn't take me long to get quickly immersed in young earth creationism. I became a very zealous young earth creationist. I read everything that I could get my hands on, and I still to this day keep up with young earth creationist material, even though I have changed my mind on the subject and am now an old earth creationist. Back then, I read it all, even the whole book of the Genesis flood, all 600 pages of it or so. In 1995, though, I read my first Hugh Ross book, and Dr. Ross, from Reasons to Believe, kind of slapped me around a little bit on my science. And I came to believe, after about a 5 or 10 year deep study into geology and astronomy, that I just believe that the Earth is old and that the universe is old. I don't have time to go into those details today. I'd love to be able to do that with you sometime, but this today is more about the interpretation of Genesis than the science. However, it was the science that convinced me that the universe and the earth were old. And it left me in the position of, what do I do now? It sort of put me in a worldview crisis of faith almost. I don't want to say that I wasn't going to become or I was going to leave Christianity behind, but I will say that it had greatly affected my thinking on biblical inerrancy and biblical authority. So I wanted to make sure that I understood what Genesis taught on the subject. So I did a deep study of every view of Genesis that I could find, because I literally had to know which interpretation of Genesis I thought was correct. It wasn't as though I wanted to be vague on the subject and just thought, okay, well, Genesis can handle it. It's really that I wanted to know which particular view of Genesis I thought the author intended for us to understand. Some of these views Dr. Craig has already covered, so you've already heard some of them. Some of them he's still yet to cover. And I won't go over the details of each one of them, but I will say that I landed on the last one once I did my deep study of Genesis. On your outline, I gave you the names of the people that advocate those particular views in case you ever want to look up a book on the subject by those particular authors. They are all out there. What I did, though, was I went through each one of these views and compared point to counterpoint, one argument for and what the other one said against, and went back and forth. And had I already found a book that I thought represented my view, I wouldn't have written one. I'd just be advocating that particular book to you today. But the Days of Divine Fiat view was only presented in one book written by a man named Alan Hayward called Creation and Evolution that he wrote back in 1985, which is out of print now. And he has some theological issues in his Christology. So anyhow, I wanted to revive the view, if you will. So that's the reason that I wrote the book. There are a few copies of it available. Before I get into that, though, I want to say a quick word about concordism. Concordism is usually looked as a bad thing, like you're trying to read science into the text, or you're trying to force the text to say something that it's not actually saying. Even though it is true that the science made me take another look at the text, what's not true is I was not trying to read the science into the text. I wanted to look at the text as though how the original audience would have understood the text. So some examples of hard concordism that I would consider to be not good would be saying that you should read the days of Genesis as long periods of time because the earth is old. I have read people who said that, here are a variety of different interpretations of the word yom. We should select the one that science agrees with, and I don't agree with that method of hermeneutic. So another example would be reading the expansion of the universe into verses that speak of stretching out the heavens, like a tent. You may have heard some people do that. Again, I think that's taking science and reading something into the text that really wasn't originally meant to be there. But lest you think that old earth creationists are the only ones that do this, young earth creationists can sometimes be as guilty of it as old earth creationists. So thinking that the expanse is the atmosphere of the earth or outer space or a vapor canopy is an example of young earth creationists reading their science into the text. They have rejected now the vapor canopy idea that Henry Morris used to expound on so greatly, and you'll still find that in his Apologetics Bible, still advocated in there, even though the modern young earth creationist organizations have rejected it for biblical and scientific reasons. So we all need to be careful about reading our science into the text, and I think hard concordism would be wrong. However, soft concordism, when you look at some examples of that, I don't see any problem with this. In other words, I don't have a problem with taking a closer look at the interpretation of a passage because of some clear scientific finding. This is essentially what happened when Copernicus and Galileo started realizing that the evidence showed that the earth is the one that orbits around the sun, that the sun doesn't go around us. What they started doing then, because of that, people who were interpreting passages like Joshua, that the sun stood still, they interpreted those passages to be phenomenological language, that that's the way it appears from us. But that's not the way they took it before that. So I don't have a problem with taking a fresh look at Genesis simply because the science says that there is an age problem going on here. I don't see that as a problem. Also allowing science to substantiate a biblical truth claim. If the Bible makes a claim that can be examined by science, then let's let science answer the question. An example would be the Bible says that the earth had a beginning, or the universe had a beginning. Well, science has now shown that to be the case. So I think it substantiates the Bible. It's not a concordist position necessarily, or it would be a soft concordist position. By that I mean that the Bible and science are in accord with one another. They do not contradict each other. I do not believe that there are scientific errors in the Bible. However, like history and archaeology that would be used to corroborate a biblical claim, I believe science can do the same thing. So I don't have a problem with being called a concordist because I do believe that the Bible and science are in accord with one another. I'll give you an overview of the prophetic days view. It advocates that the days of Genesis are 7 real, literal, historical days in which God spoke what was going to happen, and then his fiats or prophecies were fulfilled after the 7 days. It's not any different than like Isaiah says here, I am God and there is no one like me, declaring the end from the beginning. So from the beginning, God declares the end, and we see that all through the Bible. And that word beginning there, by the way, is the same one in Genesis 1:1. Prophetic days view also takes the entire text very literally. I don't take the text metaphorically. I don't take it analogically. I don't see that there's Hebrew poetry in there. It doesn't contain the type of metaphors that things like Psalms and Job and Proverbs have. It's very literal. In fact, there's not a word in Genesis 1 that I don't take literally. It is a simple presentation or interpretation that anyone can understand, including children, and I have tried it on a few to make sure, and I believe the original audience would have understood it as well. It's not difficult to understand that God speaks something and then it happens at a later time. It also allows for the age of the universe to essentially become a non-issue, because the Bible simply doesn't specify whether the earth or the universe is old. So the earth or the universe could be any age and still be reconciled with what the Bible says. In fact, somebody could even believe my particular interpretation of Genesis and still be a young earth creationist, for example. You could just believe that it didn't take God very long to fulfill what he said he was going to do. So, that is an overview of it. In my book in chapter 2, unless you buy an online version, which was a self-printed version, a self-published version, it's in chapter 3. But in the new version, these are the 5 points that I expound upon, and I do not have time today, in the limited time that I have, to go through all of the textual evidence to support each one of the 5 points. But I am going to go through the text here in a little bit and just point out a few of these. So the 5 points of my view are, number 1, the earth existed an unspecified amount of time before the 7 days started. The earth and the heavens are there before the 7 days begin in verse 3 when God says, and God said. The beginning is an unspecified block of time, not a moment, in which God initially created the heavens and the earth before the 7 days. It doesn't say at the beginning, it doesn't say at the first moment of time, it says in the beginning, and the beginning is a block of time. The creation account is given by God to humanity from our perspective as if we were watching what God was doing from the surface of the earth. In our modern day of satellites and photography, we're used to seeing the earth, as a swirling planet from outer space, but the account is written from a surface perspective, and that helps us understand some things about the text. There's a lot I could say about that, but I won't have time today. Number 4, the fulfillments of the proclamations that God said on the 6 days were not meant to be understood as fulfilled or initiated within the day they were given. I've already mentioned that point. And number 5 is really a conclusion. If the beginning was an unspecified block of time before the 6 days, and the prophecies given on the days were not completely fulfilled on the days given, then Genesis does not tell us the age of the universe or the earth. The 7 days are sandwiched between 2 unspecified blocks of time, the beginning before the 7 days and the time it took God to fulfill his proclamations afterward. The 2 points that I want to make some specific points on today are the things that make my particular view unique amongst all the others, and that is the 7 days were a real, literal, normal week on earth where God proclaimed what he was going to do. That's the part that's probably going to be disagreed by old earth creationists. And then God did not fulfill his proclamations on the day he spoke them. That's the part that's going to be disagreed by young earth creationists. So I'm an equal opportunity offender today. I'll offend both old earth and young earth creationists. So let's take a look at literal versus metaphorical days. As far as I'm concerned, everything in the text of Genesis 1 can be taken literally, so why make the days an exception to that rule? I don't see any reason to take the days in some sort of metaphorical or analogical or non-literal way, like ages, for example. Everything in the text, each word in the text is a very simple word in Hebrew. It has a fairly simple definition to it. I see no reason for days to be an exception to that rule. I also see that the very first time that God uses the word day in the text in Genesis, he defines its meaning for us. The very first time the word is used, God says, and God called the light day. So what is day? What does day mean? It's the daylight hours. What is that bright thing in the sun, in the sky today, by the way? I hadn't seen that in a long time. But that's day. It's daylight hours. God called the light day. He contrasted it with night. So day and night make 24 hours. Incidentally, using the word yom, which is day in Hebrew, to mean the daylight hours is the most common way that the word is used in the Hebrew Bible, in the Old Testament. The second most common way is an unspecified amount of time, by the way. But when it's used as an unspecified amount of time, it usually has a prefix with it, like Bayom, in the day, or Hayom, which is the day. So you'll see the day of the Lord or the day of judgment or something like that is referring to usually a longer period of time. Anyhow, God defined it in the text for us, and I don't see any reason why any other uses of it in the text mean anything else other than that. The first time the word day is used to mean something else is in Genesis 2:4, which is the beginning of the next account. In Genesis 1, it always means daylight, as far as I'm concerned. The evening and morning phrase read like normal sequential days. We've heard that in here a number of times now. It's in that order. Evening is listed first rather than morning. You would think if it was some sort of metaphorical device, it might say, and there was morning and there was evening, like morning is the metaphor for the early part of a long period of time and evening is the latter part, but that's not the way it reads. Evening comes first and then morning. So it reads like sequential days, and I believe the purpose of the evening and morning phrase is to connect each day to the next. Quite honestly, if the days were meant to be understood as something like a metaphor or an analogy, I don't even see the purpose of why God put the evening and morning phrase in there. I don't even understand why it would be there on each day. If the days are taken as metaphorical, analogical, or ages just to reconcile them with the scientific age, then as far as I'm concerned, that's akin to hard concordism. We're only doing it to somehow reconcile the text with ages. Again, I have a problem with that hermeneutical method. I wouldn't want to read that into the text. Now, if there were other good reasons to take it as a metaphor, like there are in so many of the Psalms, for example, where you have poetic language used, then okay, but I don't see that in Genesis. So as far as I'm concerned, the days are literal. And when I saw that in the text, even though Hugh Ross convinced me that the science said that the universe was old, he was not able to convince me that the days were ages. And I do admire the man, by the way. He actually endorsed my book despite my criticisms of his view, which I appreciate about him. So, as far as the textual evidence for the prophetic days view, everything was not fulfilled in 6 days. The proclamations are spoken. When I started looking at the text, I noticed the proclamations are spoken in such a way that they cannot be fulfilled in a day. Some of them are. So what we're going to do, before I go through each day real quick, I want to just point out, look for this as you see as we go through these. There's a fivefold pattern on each day. There's a proclamation or two or three where it says, and God said. There's a fulfillment phrase, usually it's, and it was so. There are action phrases by God or parenthetical statements that aren't necessarily in chronological order. It's just extra information that we're given. Then there's the evening and morning phrase and a numbered day, lastly. And each day has that pattern, although sometimes the fulfillment phrase comes after the action phrase. So sometimes number 2 and 3 there are switched. So let's take a look. Let's go through the text. I'm not going to read the entire text, but I want to point out some things about each part of it. So Genesis 1:1 through 1:2. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was desolate and empty, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. The Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters. Notice the word surface is used twice in verse 2 to emphasize the fact that that's our perspective. God wants to know wants us to know that He's telling us the story from that perspective. In fact, the term heavens and earth is a human perspective of the universe. It's everything up there, the heavens, and then everything down here, which is on the land. And I pointed out before, it says in the beginning, not at the beginning or at the first moment of time. It literally means in the first block of time, God created the heavens and the earth. And then it tells us the condition that the earth was in, which is the reason I don't believe the revelatory days view that Dr. Craig mentioned last week. I believe that it tells us specifically when God spoke these things, and it's when the earth was in a desolate and empty condition that He began to speak over the earth and transform it. So He's speaking in advance of it happening, not giving us a revelation of it afterward, even though the whole account is a revelation after the fact. So, point is, verses 1 and 2 are outside of the main narrative of the text. You don't have a proclamation. I don't know if you've ever noticed this. There is no proclamation where God says, let there be a heavens and an earth. The heavens and the earth are already there on day 1 when God said, and let there be light, or let there be light. They're already assumed to be in the text. Also, when you look at the text, you'll see that every time God says something, what God said is specifically said to have come to pass. But again, we're not given anything that says, God said, let there be a heavens and an earth, and then God made it's just assumed in the beginning. So these are outside the main text, which begins in verse 3. So not everything was completed in 6 days, because the heavens and the earth were created outside of the 6 days. Incidentally, if you have disagreements with some of the things that I say along here, if you'll let me just get through this, I'm planning on doing Q&A at the end, and we'll have plenty of time, and I'll hang around as long as anybody wants to talk about this, by the way, just so you know. So, Genesis 1, 3 through 5, day 1. I want to emphasize something that is unique about this text. This is the only day where God says, let there be light, and there was light. Let light be, and light was. It is that emphatic in the Hebrew. It's not like that on any other day. Why is that the case? Because I believe this is the one day where it had to be fulfilled on the day that it was spoken, because it was dark before this, and in order to actually delineate 6 days and nights, you got to have some day. So day 1 has to be fulfilled on day 1. Hence it's put in this very emphatic form, so that we will actually have day and night over a period of 6 real days. Notice though, as you go through the rest of the text, think about the time frame here. God says, let there be light, and there was light. Okay, now we can see. God saw that the light was good. So you can imagine the light comes, and now he sees that it's good. God separated the light from the darkness. Now we have light and darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. Well, when did he do that? See, that's more like a parenthetical phrase. The fact that it's a language and that it's telling us what to call it and giving us definition, that is for humanity. This is extra information. It's not necessarily that God called it light on that day. We have the first indication in the text then that maybe some of the information that's given to us didn't actually happen on that day. And there was evening and there was morning one day. Day 2. Then God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters. I highlighted that because I want you to realize that the expanse, at least as far as day 2 is concerned, is limited to being between the waters above and the waters below. The waters below are identified as seas. The waters above aren't really identified in the text, but if you think about it from a very simple standpoint, it's rain or clouds. Okay, that would be the way I think the original audience understood it. And the expanse is the space. Understand, it's the space between them. It's not outer space, it's the space between the clouds. I'll come back to that in a little bit. God proclaims it, let there be an expanse. Then it says God made it. So there's an emphasis on what God said and then what God did. And then later it says, and it was so. I just wanted you to see that in this case, the extra information, God making the expanse, is actually before the fulfillment phrase, which is usually and it was so, or and so it came to pass. Just notice that it's in that order on day 2. On day 3a, the first part, there's 2 proclamations on day 3. So on the first one, God says, let the waters below the heavens be gathered into one place and let dry land appear. My point here is it's not real emphatic, but it is telling the waters to do its part and telling the land to do its part. We're shifting away from God doing it to the waters gathering and the dry land doing the appearing, even though God is acting upon them. But I won't make too much of a dogmatic point on that, because it gets stronger as we move on through the text to show that these things couldn't happen in a day. So 3b, let the earth sprout vegetation, or vegetate vegetation, if you will, or sprout sprouts. The noun in the Hebrew, the noun and the verb here are the same, or derived from one another. So let the earth sprout sprouts, new growth, which would include plants yielding seed and fruit trees on the earth bearing fruit. So God is saying, let those things begin to grow. And it was so. The proclamation is fulfilled. And the earth brought forth vegetation. Different verb. Brought forth means to facilitate the production of, to bring out. to produce, as it's sometimes translated in some versions. So God says, let the earth sprout plants. They begin to grow, and it was fulfilled, and the earth brought forth vegetation. It's not talking about highly accelerated growth there. Day 4, let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens. We saw that word expanse back on day 2, and remember, I said back on day 2, the expanse is identified as being between the waters. Okay? God also called the expanse heavens back then. Now on day 4, God is saying, let there be lights in the clear space. Do you understand what he just said? God proclaimed for there to be lights. Let the lights come to be in the clear space of the heavens. So now it's possible to see what was causing the light on the earth. You couldn't see what was causing the light on the earth prior to that. On day 1, there was no expanse. The waters came all the way down to the surface, so it's like a foggy day. On day 2, it's like an overcast day. The expanse, the clear space, is between the waters. The waters above are the clouds, the waters below are the seas. Now on day 4, the lights, the things that are causing the light on the earth, are proclaimed to come to be in a new location from where they were before. From the perspective of the surface of the earth, they were not in the expanse, but as of the proclamation on day 4, they come to be in the clear space of the heavens. In fact, in the expanse of the heavens is repeated 3 times in the text, just to emphasize that. You notice, and let them be for lights in the expanse of the heavens. God placed them in the expanse of the heavens. It uses that phrase 3 times just so you don't miss the meaning of that text or the meaning of that phrase, which I missed for a long time. And let them be, there's 2 parts to this proclamation. Let the lights come to be in the expanse, and let them be for signs and seasons and days and years. Let people use the lights to measure time. That's what it's saying. And of course it says, and it was so, but it couldn't be so on day 4. There's not anybody there to measure time on day 4. This proclamation cannot be fulfilled on the day that it is given. In fact, it would be at least day 6 before it could be fulfilled, and then it would be at least a year after day 6 because it says it's got to be used to measure years. Day 5. Even though this proclamation technically could be fulfilled in a day, there's definitely a phrase in day 5 that cannot be fulfilled in a day. God said, let the waters teem or swarm with swarms of living creatures. Again, here's another place where the verb and the noun are the same. And let birds fly above, and that's another place, by the way, let flyers fly above the earth in the open expanse of the heavens. God created the great sea animals and every living creature that moves. So he created all of these things in order for the proclamation to be fulfilled. But then it says, God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply and fill the waters and the seas and let birds multiply on the earth. So he didn't create the earth full of birds. He said, let them multiply on the earth. He didn't create the seas full of sea creatures. He told them to do it. What we have here is a clear statement that cannot be accomplished on this day. And it would mean that the streams and so forth would not be full of fish whenever Adam decided that he might want to eat one of them, for example. Regardless of whether you believe that was before or after the fall, we'll have to have that discussion some other time. Anyhow, we have a clear example here that this takes longer than a day to fulfill. This is another example that is clearly can't be fulfilled on the day that it was spoken. God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures. Well, how does the earth produce living creatures? I don't believe this is an evolutionary process it's talking about here. When you have a good land, when you have land where there's plenty of rain and there's plenty of plant growth, what do you also have? You also have a lot of animals that are surviving off of it. When you have a desert, you don't have a lot of animals. So what God is saying is here is let the earth begin to facilitate the production of living creatures. And it was so. The proclamation is fulfilled. But wait a minute. And God made the beasts of the earth. Notice it's out of chronological order. Why not just say, let the earth bring forth, or why not say something like, let us make living creatures to fill the earth, and God created the living creatures, and it was so. He could have easily said it that way. But that is not the way the text reads. The text literally reads, let the earth produce living creatures, and it was so. But in order for the earth to do its part, parenthetical statement, God has to make the creatures first in order for the proclamation to be fulfilled. But there's no way that animals can begin to multiply on the earth or can actually produce on the earth. They could begin to multiply, I suppose, but they can't actually produce anything more of themselves on day 6. The latter part of day 6, then God said, let us make man in our image according to our likeness. That's the first part of the proclamation. Second part of the proclamation says, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the sky and over the cattle of all the earth and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. There's 2 parts to this proclamation. You can imagine that God created mankind in one day, because I think Genesis 2 says he formed man from the dust of the earth and breathed into his nostrils. So I believe that that is miraculous creation, where you create a creature in one day, or in an instant, if you will, and they become a living creature at that point. So you can imagine that the first part of it could be fulfilled in a day, but there's no way that second part can be fulfilled in a day. It doesn't say let them be rulers. It's not a noun. Let mankind be the ruler. It's not what it says. Let them rule over the fish of the sea. Of course, later, all the way down in verse 30, it says, and it was so. Mankind actually fulfilled what was proclaimed. So again, here we have an example that cannot be fulfilled on the day that it was spoken. We turn to day 7. I've rearranged the text here a little bit to reflect more literally the Hebrew. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed and all their hosts. I want you to notice verse 2. And God completed on the 7th day his work which he did. There's something that God finished, on the 7th day. We don't normally think of him working on the 7th day, but according to the text, literally, he finished a work on the 7th day. The 7th day was part of the work that he finished, even though he didn't do any work on that day. And he rested on the 7th day from all his work which he did. What we have is an addition in the second line of all the work versus the work that he completed in 7 days. So my question to you, according to the literal meaning of the text here, is there a difference between the work, his work that he completed on the 7th day, and all his work which he rested from? I think that there is. The work that he finished on the 7th day was a 6-day work where he proclaimed what he was going to do. And then all the work that he rested from on the 7th day includes the fulfillments of the proclamations that he was going to do at a later time. And we're told that he rested on the 7th day, and he did this as a pattern for mankind. And then verse 3, God blessed the 7th day. You know, interesting, when God blesses something, when he blessed mankind, it says, and God blessed mankind saying, and then we're told what he said. And God blessed the sea creatures saying, and then we're told what he says. But on day 7, God blessed the 7th day, but it doesn't say what he said. When did he bless the 7th day? I want to submit to you that had he actually said something on the 7th day, it would have been construed as work. So he didn't say anything on the 7th day. When he blessed the 7th day was later in time, possibly even as late as when the law came into existence. And he sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work, which God created to make. Some translations say created and made. When you get down into the nitty-gritty of the Hebrew here, though, and you look at some of the footnotes in the Bibles, it literally means created to make, or to do, or for doing. God created work for him to do. 6 days, he said what it was going to happen. He created work for him to do afterward. So when you put all this together, it looks like this. You have the first moment of time, the beginning, which is a block of time, Genesis 1:2. Then you have the earth as it existed in Genesis 1:2. You have a 7-day work where he proclaims how he's going to transform the earth into a place that's going to be very good for humanity. And then you have the amount of time to fulfill the proclamations until Adam and Eve fulfilled the final proclamation. We're not told how long the beginning is, and we're not told how long the amount of time was to fulfill the proclamations. So you can insert whatever time you want to in that point, be it long or short. I think science is then free to answer the question without really worrying about whether it contradicts what the Bible says. So if you insert the scientific ages in here, you have the Big Bang 13.8 billion years ago. The beginning would be between 13.8 and 3.9 billion years ago. The time when God decided to speak was right at the end of what's known as the Hadean era, when the earth is actually just beginning to be habitable, about 3.9 billion years ago, when life begins on the earth. And then you have the 7-day work at that time, and the amount of time is the amount of time that has transpassed since that time. And that is the conclusion of my presentation today. I hope you have enjoyed it, and I will be happy to take question and answers. We have the microphone, so yes, ma'am.
Are you saying that during that literal 7 days was when he proclaimed it to be fulfilled at some future time?
That is what I believe, yes, ma'am.
Okay. And I wondered, I'm sorry, but can you just back up to the slide that starts the 7 days were real, literal, normal? And you were right. Yeah, I think. Yeah.
That
right
one,
there. Yeah,
or that one?
No, the one that just had the 2 bullet points. I wanted to write that down. But so it took him 7 days to proclaim, if you will, and then
technically 6 days to proclaim, and then resting on the seventh day. Yes, and we're told what he literally said on each of the 6 days.
Several points.
Sure.
First of all, the last slide that you had, we can use that as a reference. I think it is the 4th day, the time setting. Prior to 4th day, it's a timelessness, because you can have days and you can have earth that sprouts, and it's all in the timeless zone. And Dr. Craig talk about that creation, the time set in the beginning of creation. So the 4th day actually defines what time is, and whether there's a man or not, whether we keep tab or not, all the mechanism define time already.
Well, what I believe is that you would have a hard time saying then on day 1, 2, and 3 that there was evening and there was morning, because evening and morning, as far as I'm concerned, are timekeeping devices where you have a day and a nighttime passing on the earth. So I see that you can have a day and a nighttime and a real literal day, even though you can't see the lights that are actually causing the problem.
Okay, so let's use a different reference, that on the 7th day, God rested in his design.
Mm-hmm.
Not so much how much time, but each day is God's design, and so he rested in his design, and he blessed it in this design. And so instead of we get hung up how much time and when it's fulfilled, it's actually the design is set in and it was rested upon.
I think God did. He gave us a revelation of what he did over a week to give us a pattern for our lives that he wanted us to follow. And I think the best way for somebody to demonstrate a pattern to follow is to actually follow the pattern themselves. Right. So I believe that God worked on 6 days and then he rested on the 7th, just like we would normally do. According to my view, by the way, the 7th day, the 7th day would not be a continuing day. I know there's a lot of people that make a lot out of that. But they make a lot out of the fact that it doesn't have the evening and morning phrase on the 7th day, for example. I think the purpose of the evening and morning phrase is to connect it to the next day. And since there is no eighth day of importance to connect the seventh day to, there's no reason to have the phrase there. And the other verses that are used to support the idea that the seventh day is a continuing day don't support it as strongly as I think.
One last point.
Yes, ma'am.
The evening and morning is that when God comes in the first day, it was from formless chaos into light penetrating. So each creation is from a less order into a higher degree of orderliness. That's why that evening and morning, so the morning, it creates this, the creation set in, right? So
I would agree with you that as the creation progresses, that it becomes increasingly better for mankind. But I don't know that I would call it a chaos. We typically call it a chaos. There's a lot of commentators that refer to it that way too, and it dates back to a Greek idea of order out of chaos. And God is not that way.
well,
God creates order from the beginning, and then He may organize it to be a little more specific. But I don't see it as being chaotic.
it's designless into design. So evening is designless into the day where the design set in. So anyway, so that's what
I actually say it's designed even from the beginning, from the Big Bang. There's design.
You and I are going to have an interesting lunch.
All right, Jonathan.
Let me I'll have a lot of questions, but we'll stick with two.
By the way, before you get into that, Bobby, can you stop me if I go over time? Okay, Merritt. I don't know. What time is it right now?
Now, but you can take Jonathan's and you can take his agenda.
It's 12:15 now?
Okay.
Yeah, that's unfortunate with my presentation.
So
They're long.
You take the verse and let there be light, and it was so. And you gave that as an example of something that occurs immediately after God says it. But I don't understand how you're getting that exegetically. The text itself seems to be latitudinarian with respect to.
You could say that it's not specific there in the text. However, the Hebrew language there is much more emphatic than it is in any other place. Let light be, and light was. I mean, it's two words. Light be, light was.
It still seems to be underdeterminative in that respect. It doesn't say when it was.
My arguments, though, for the days being normal days aren't just that part. It's also the fact that God defined day for us as daylight and the evening and morning phrase, which really appear to be like normal. And then you have a numbered sequence, too, which also adds to the fact that it's a literal timekeeping device.
The second part I had was with respect to your distinction between hard and soft concordism. And with respect to concordism, you say we should look at the text again when there's something that's clear. But as odd as it may seem, I don't understand what's meant by clear.
Yeah, when is science clear, right?
I mean, either clarity is either person relative, or either by clarity you're talking about a sort of scientific consensus.
Well, is there any reason at all right now to doubt that the Earth is orbiting the sun?
No.
No. Right. So we're pretty clear on that one, right?
Right.
Okay. Is there any reason to doubt that the Earth is 4.6 billion years old?
No.
Well, there's a lot of people in this room that would say yes.
Okay.
Okay. And are we as clear on the one as we're clear on the other? I would say probably not. But I think that there are good reasons to believe that the Earth is at least older than 6,000 years. And there are at least some really clear reasons that convince me of that fact. I just didn't have time to go into them. There's only a few of them that are in the book. But there's a few that are there. Yes.
Okay.
One more question. And then y'all just tackle me afterward. Okay.
Okay. All right. Mine's a fairly simple question, but the phrase that's repeated, and God saw it was good. That seems like past just before the evening and morning statement, which seems to like imply that it already happened. How do you rationalize that phrase in each of these days?
I think that God seeing that it's good is emphasizing something in the text that we often don't think about. and that is the fact that the nature of God is that he's good. I think the reason why it is repeated over and over again, it says, for example, that he who comes to God must believe that he is, and believe that he is a rewarder of those who seek him. We have a lot of people out there who believe in God, but who don't really believe that he's a good God. And so I see I see that as an emphasis in the text. As for whether it happened before if you're saying that it's saying that he saw that it was good, it was completed, I see it as a parenthetical statement that's not necessarily in chronological order. And God saw that it was good is not listed on day 2. So we have at least one day where the phrase is not there, which has made a lot of commentators wonder why the phrase is not on day 2. In fact, the Septuagint translators inserted it just so it would be there. I think the phrase is there to emphasize some important things, but I don't know that it is necessarily in chronological order. It would be my point.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you. I appreciate your time.